My brother passed away today. It was our mother who discovered him. After years of battling depression, enduring heartbreak, doubting himself, and feeling betrayed by those he loved, he finally reached his breaking point. It only took one bullet, a small piece of metal, to put an end to a lifetime of suffering. As I entered the house, I was met with the gut-wrenching cries of our mother. I bolted up the stairs and into his room, where I found her cradling his body, desperately begging him to breathe. The blood, God, the blood was everywhere. It painted the wall behind her in dark red, contrasting with the old, worn-out white paint, almost like some twisted, unfinished artwork. His blood covered our mother as she held his lifeless body, screaming over and over, "Breathe! Please, breathe!" It wasn't long before the ambulance and the police showed up. They had to force our mother's hands off him. She wouldn't let go, as if by holding on tightly enough, she could keep his soul from leaving. I spent hours talking to the cops while my mother was taken to the hospital, overwhelmed by shock. They quickly ruled out any foul play, especially since only his fingerprints were on the gun. I was surprisingly numb to it all. He was my brother, and I did love him. But in that moment, I felt nothing. Was it shock? Or maybe some kind of guilt? I eventually returned home and decided to sleep on the couch in the living room downstairs. I couldn't bring myself to pass by his room to get to mine. I just wasn't ready for that. I tried to sleep, but after a day of feeling nothing, one emotion finally caught up with me. It wasn't grief or anger, it was fear. I was alone in the house, but I could hear footsteps upstairs in his room, pacing back and forth. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of loud knocking on the door. Somehow I had managed to fall asleep despite the fear. Ignoring the knocking for a moment, I strained to listen for any noise upstairs. Nothing. I pushed the memory of those footsteps from the night before out of my mind. Just a nightmare, I thought. After all, it had been a long and traumatic day. I walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. "Shit," I muttered under my breath. It was her, my brother's ex-girlfriend. Dealing with her was the last thing I wanted to do. Reluctantly, I opened the door. She just stood there, tears welling up in her eyes. I gave her a look, one that said, "Yes, it's true." She broke down, crying uncontrollably. Seeing her in tears must have triggered something in me, because for the first time, I cried too. We held each other in the doorway, sobbing together for what felt like an eternity. After a while, she stopped, still with tears in her eyes, and I gestured for her to come inside. We sat on the couch in silence, both lost in our thoughts, avoiding eye contact. Then she finally said it. I knew it was coming. The same thought had been running through my mind all day. "You know this is our fault. We killed him." "No," I said after a moment. "We messed up, yeah, but we didn't kill him. We didn't put the gun to his head and pull the damn trigger. He did that." "We might as well have," she whispered. "Look," I said, my voice rising. "He struggled with this his whole life. He's the one who gave up and ended it. He was the coward, not us." "How can you say that?" she asked, horrified. "Because it's the truth," I yelled. "He wasn't the only one who suffered. I suffered, you suffered. Hell, that's life. He chose to give up," I shouted. "That's exactly what a coward does." She paused before speaking again. "You can call him a coward all you want, but it doesn't change what we did to him. It doesn't change the fact that we hurt someone who loved us," she said softly. My mind flashed back to that night, just a few days before he died. She had been arguing with him again. In a fit of anger, he stormed out of the house. I came home to find her in the kitchen crying. Shit, they were fighting again, I thought. She looked up at me and said, "It's over." I had always loved her, ever since we were kids. But my brother did what I never had the guts to do. He went for it. I always resented him for that. I never told him. But deep down, I think he knew how I felt about her. That night, seeing her so broken, tore me apart. I just wanted to comfort her, to show her that everything would be okay, that the world wasn't ending. We ended up in my room. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I had dreamed of this moment for so long. That night was the best night of my life. I had been with other women before her, but nothing compared to that night with her. I finally understood what it meant to truly love someone. To my dismay, I realized that night that I wasn't just in love with her. I was in love with her. We fell asleep in each other's arms, and that was our biggest mistake. The next morning, I woke up to find her still naked beside me. To my horror, I saw my brother standing over the bed, just staring at me with a blank expression, no emotion in his eyes. He looked empty, completely drained of life. She stayed with me the rest of that day. We didn't say much. Both of us were still trying to wrap our heads around the fact that he was really gone. My mind just wouldn't stop racing, no matter how hard I tried to quiet the thoughts. A whirlwind of emotions ran through me. First sorrow, then anger, and strangely, a bit of happiness. Not because he was dead, but because she was here with me. I hated myself for feeling that way. I hated my brother. I hated the whole world and wanted to burn it all down. She left in the afternoon to go back home. We had the funeral service planned for early the next morning, and once again, I was alone. I decided to make a quick trip to the hospital to check on our mother. She had thankfully moved past the shock and was now deep in the grieving phase. We sat together and just cried. "It's nobody's fault, Ma. He always had his struggles," I whispered. "I know," she replied, "but still, you wonder if we could have done something, if maybe we didn't do enough. Ma, he's gone. Nothing's going to change that. Don't punish yourself. We have to accept that he's gone. It's just, She hesitated. My baby is gone." She broke down again, and I knew it was too soon for words to bring her any comfort. I just stayed by her side, letting her cry. I got back home around 2 in the morning. The thought of being alone in that house again unnerved me. Would I hear those footsteps again? I sat on the couch, still not ready to face going upstairs. The house was eerily quiet. I sighed in relief. Better to have this silence than to think I was losing my mind. I got comfortable on the couch, slowly drifting towards sleep. Just before I crossed over into a dream, I heard a faint but unmistakable whisper. "Do you really think I'm a coward?" The day of the funeral arrived, and I couldn't breathe. Everyone was there, our parents, old friends, even people I didn't recognize. But most importantly, she was there. The room was thick with sorrow, but I couldn't cry along with them. I couldn't even breathe. It felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on my chest. She noticed and took my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I know it hurts, but I'm here with you," she said softly. I forced a smile in her direction, but she didn't understand what I was really going through. No one in that room did. Sweat started to beat on my forehead as my breathing became more rapid. All the guests looked at me with sympathy, thinking I was mourning my brother. They couldn't see what was really happening. I finally couldn't take it anymore. "Are you all fucking blind?" I shouted. "Can't any of you see it?" With all their confused and concerned faces staring back at me, the truth hit me hard. I was alone. None of them could see what was terrorizing me. My brother, my dead brother, was standing right next to his casket, smiling at me, right beside his own lifeless body. Weeks passed since the funeral, and I hadn't left the house once. I couldn't bring myself to do it. She came by to visit, bringing some groceries with her. "I know it's been tough, but you've got to start moving on. Come outside with me. Let's take a walk," she urged. I stayed silent, seeing the frustration building in her eyes. "Look," she said after a long pause, "you're not the one who died. He's gone. The last thing he would have wanted is for you to lock yourself up in here and waste away. He would have wanted you to move on with your life." I stared at her, heartbroken to see her like this, knowing I was the cause. Just as I was about to respond, he interrupted me. "She's wrong. I don't want you to move on. I want you to suffer like I did. You're the reason I'm dead. You're the reason I'm still in agony, even in death. I cannot rest, so neither will you," he said coldly. I just stood there, powerless, staring at his lifeless face. He looked so pale, the right side of his head marred by the bullet hole where it entered. His brown eyes were empty, devoid of life, and that unnatural ear-to-ear smile never left his face. What began as footsteps in the night had turned into a nightmare I couldn't escape. He was always there, always smiling at me. Every morning I woke up hoping he would be gone, but he was always there to greet me with a simple, "Hello, brother," and that same twisted smile. I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm sorry, I never meant to hurt you," I cried out. "Don't apologize, you didn't hurt me," she replied, thinking I was talking to her. She had no idea my brother was there, tormenting me. I took a deep breath, looked into her eyes, and confessed, "I need help. I think I've been hallucinating." 3 weeks have passed since I was admitted to the hospital. They've put me on all kinds of medications, but nothing's worked. I'm getting fed up with being here. He's still always there, rarely speaking, just standing and smiling that cold, haunting smile. He taunts me every time the doctors come in, standing right next to them, invisible to everyone but me. It is never easy losing a loved one to suicide. It makes you wonder if it was somehow your fault. You have to accept that this wasn't your doing, and you need to let go of this guilt. That guilt is why you keep seeing him, the therapist said. My brother stood right beside her, that twisted smile on his face, nodding as if in mock agreement. Another 2 weeks passed and still nothing changed. More pills, more therapy sessions, yet I couldn't get rid of him. He was always there, and as time passed, his appearance grew more grotesque. His face was decomposing, skin half peeled off, hanging loosely. His teeth, once yellow, had turned black and rotten. His eyes, once brown, were now entirely black. But the worst part was that smile, always that hideous, wide smile. "Look at me, look what you did to me," he laughed. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," I cried. "If you really are, then make it right," he said coldly. "How?" I asked, knowing full well what he meant, but still hoping for another answer. "End our torment, brother." I curled up in bed and cried myself to sleep. The next morning, I checked myself out of the hospital. Since I had admitted myself voluntarily, they couldn't keep me there against my will. They had their chance, but their pills did nothing. I found myself standing before 2 large bronze doors. My brother was now unrecognizable, a decaying corpse with a smile. Half his jaw was exposed, revealing blackened teeth and bare bone. His skull was visible, with only a few strands of hair left, and the bullet hole in his head was still clear as day. And yet he continued to smile that tormenting smile. "You can't get rid of me like this. There's only one way. Please set us free," he said. I ignored him and walked through the doors, finally summoning the courage I had been lacking for so long. I approached the priest, taking a deep breath, and explained everything. I told him about my brother's suicide and how he haunted me day and night. "Is he here now?" the priest asked. "Yes, he's standing right beside you," I replied quietly. The priest looked around, clearly uncomfortable. "Please help me. I don't know what else to do," I pleaded. "I will do my best, but you have to put your complete faith in God. There can be no doubt. Surrender yourself to him, and he will guide you to salvation," he said. My brother laughed. "Surrender? Sounds like he wants you to sell your soul," he smirked. I ignored him. "This isn't a possession, so an exorcism won't work. Besides, we'd need approval from the church, and that could take weeks," the priest explained. "So what can we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Pray to God for his protection and to ward off any evil spirits," he replied. "We can start with the Lord's Prayer. Do you know it?" I nodded. My brother's smile twisted into a snarl. "You can't do this to me! I'm your brother!" he screamed. We began. "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." My brother started to scream, not in anger, but in pure agony. The priest continued the prayer, and I stood there, eyes tightly shut, praying that this would finally rid me of him. My brother's screams were like nothing I had ever heard, high-pitched and full of unimaginable pain. "You already killed me, and now you want me to suffer more. Please, brother, it burns so much," he cried. The sound of his screams was horrifying, like the pain he was experiencing was beyond anything humans could inflict. I kept my eyes shut, hating what it was doing to him. He was still my brother, but I needed to be free of him. I needed relief. When I finally opened my eyes, I was horrified by what I saw. My brother was burning, his rotting flesh slowly being consumed by flames. His screams grew louder as his flesh burned away, revealing bone underneath. The priest continued to pray, but he looked at me with concern. My brother continued to burn until there was nothing left but charred bones, which slowly turned to ash. He tried to take a step toward me, but as soon as his foot hit the floor, it crumbled into dust. His body followed, collapsing into a pile of ash. His skull looked up at me one last time, a hand reaching out before it too crumbled away. Just like that, he was gone. The room was silent now. The priest had stopped praying. The only sound was my own heavy, panicked breathing. Finally, the priest spoke. "It's over. You should go home," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He was afraid, not of what had just happened, but of me. Why would he be afraid of me? I took one last look at him, then at the spot where my brother had been, and without a word, I walked out of the church. I made my way back to our home, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. This nightmare, it seemed, was finally over. Yet so many questions lingered in my mind. What had caused all of this? Was that thing truly my brother? And where was he now? But in that moment, none of it mattered. I was just relieved that it was over. I decided it was time to finally go to his room and clean up the mess he had left behind. Bracing myself, I opened the door, expecting the gruesome sight of dried blood everywhere. But what greeted me was far worse than I could have ever imagined. Sitting at the end of the bed, with that cold smile on his face, was my brother. "You can't get rid of me," he said. "I know," I replied. "The only way this ends is if you make it right," he continued. "I know," I whispered. "So do what you have to do," he urged. "I will, brother," I said, a sense of grim resolve settling in. I called her. My voice was shaky as I told her that I was hurting and didn't want to be alone. She came over right away, concerned as always. I motioned for her to come in, and she sat on the couch. I thanked her for coming, my words heavy with the weight of what I knew I had to do. She faced away from me, sitting on the couch, oblivious to what was about to happen. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly walked behind her. I didn't want to do this, but I knew I had to. With trembling hands, I pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, time stood still. My brother appeared next to her body, that same cold smile on his face. "Almost there, brother," he said. I looked at him, then at her still body lying on the floor. There was only one way to end this, one way to make right what we had done. I slowly placed the gun in my mouth. For the first time, I felt no fear, no panic, just cold, like my dead brother. My mind flashed to my mother, to all the decisions that had led me to this moment. And then, with my eyes closed, I squeezed the trigger. I expected nothingness, an end to everything, but instead, there was something else. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in the middle of an unfamiliar place. It was dark, but not the kind of darkness that you experience at night. This was a suffocating blackness, thick and oppressive, where the air felt heavy and cold against my skin. There was no sound, no movement, just a void stretching out in every direction. My heart pounded in my chest, a hollow, echoing beat that seemed to mock my attempts to find comfort in the silence. I turned slowly, trying to make sense of where I was. But no matter which way I looked, there was nothing. Nothing except a faint, glowing light in the distance. It flickered like a dying flame, but it was the only thing I could see in this endless void. With nothing else to do, I started walking toward it, each step heavy and uncertain. As I moved closer, I could see that the light was coming from a small, old-fashioned lantern, hanging from a crooked post. The light illuminated a small area around it, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. The ground itself was rough, almost like a barren, cracked earth that had been scorched and left to die. I reached out to touch the lantern, and as soon as my fingers brushed against it, the light flared up, nearly blinding me. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, and when I looked again, I wasn't alone. My brother was there, standing just outside the circle of light, his body barely visible in the darkness. He wasn't smiling this time. His expression was serious, almost sad. His once decayed and rotting face looked whole again, like the brother I remembered from before all this madness began. "Why didn't it end?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I did what you wanted." He stepped forward into the light, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "You think this is what I wanted?" he asked softly. "You think I wanted any of this?" I was taken aback. "But you said it was the only way to make it right." He shook his head slowly. "I never wanted this. Not for you, not for her, not for any of us. But you couldn't let go. You couldn't forgive yourself. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had thought that by doing what he asked, I would find peace, that the torment would end. But now, standing here in this place, I realized that nothing had changed. The guilt, the pain, it was all still with me, as heavy as before. "So what now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me with those sad, familiar eyes. "Now we wait. You'll have to face what you've done, what we've both done, but you won't do it alone." The ground beneath us began to tremble, and the darkness seemed to close in, pressing against the light of the lantern. My brother stepped closer, reaching out to me, his hand warm and solid in mine. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never wanted you to follow me here." Before I could respond, the darkness surged forward, swallowing us both. The last thing I saw was his face, and the last thing I heard was his voice, soft and distant. "We'll face it together, brother." The darkness engulfed us, pulling me down into an abyss where time felt meaningless. It was like sinking into the deepest ocean, the pressure mounting, the air growing colder. And yet, through it all, I still felt his hand in mine. My brother's presence, both a comfort and a reminder of everything we'd done. Then slowly, the darkness began to lighten. At first, it was just a faint glow, like the early morning sun struggling to break through a heavy fog. But as the light grew stronger, I realized we were no longer sinking. Instead, we were standing on solid ground again, though this place was nothing like the void we'd left behind. We were in a room, a small, simple room that felt strangely familiar. The walls were a faded yellow, the floor was scuffed wood, and the air carried the scent of old memories, both sweet and bitter. There was a bed in the corner, neatly made, and a window that let in a soft, golden light. Outside, I could see trees swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling in a peaceful rhythm. This is our old house," I said, my voice trembling with recognition. "The one we grew up in." My brother nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, it is. A place where it all started." I looked around, taking in the room, the details that brought back a flood of memories, of childhood, of laughter, of the bond we used to share before everything went so wrong. It was strange being here, in this place that was so familiar yet so distant. "Why are we here?" I asked, turning to him. "Because this is where it all began," he said softly, "and where it has to end." I stared at him, confusion and dread gnawing at my insides. "I don't understand. I thought it was over." He shook his head slowly. "It's not over until you accept it, until you let go of everything that's been holding you down. The guilt, the anger, the pain. You have to face it, truly face it, or it will keep you trapped, just like it did to me." His words cut deep, and I felt the weight of everything I'd done, everything I'd tried to run from, pressing down on me. I wanted to argue, to deny it, but deep down, I knew he was right. I had been holding on to the guilt, the self-loathing, refusing to let myself heal. "But how?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I let go?" He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "By forgiving yourself, by understanding that we were both broken, that we both made mistakes. But that doesn't mean we have to be defined by them. It's time to make peace with what happened, to make peace with me." I felt a lump in my throat, my chest tightening with emotion. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't want any of this." His smile was sad, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I know. I've always known. And I'm sorry too, for leaving you, for not being strong enough to stay. But it's time to forgive ourselves, to let go of the past and find some kind of peace." The tears spilled over, and I felt a sob rise in my chest. "I don't know if I can." "You can," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We can, together." He reached out, pulling me into a tight embrace, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a sense of relief, of release. The pain was still there, but it wasn't as sharp, as overwhelming. It was a part of me, yes, but it didn't control me anymore. As we stood there holding each other, the room around us began to change. The light grew brighter, warmer, and the scent of the old house faded, replaced by something cleaner, fresher. The walls dissolved into a beautiful landscape, a serene field bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The air was filled with the soft hum of life, of peace. He pulled back slightly, looking into my eyes one last time. "It's time for you to go," he said, his voice full of warmth and love. "You have a life to live, a future to embrace. Don't waste it like I did." I nodded, tears still streaming down my face, but there was a sense of calm now, a sense of acceptance. "I'll never forget you." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "I'll always be with you, but not like this. Not in pain, not in regret. You're free now, and so am I." I watched as he slowly began to fade, his form dissolving into the light. And as he disappeared, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me, a feeling of weight lifting from my shoulders. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying in my own bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful silence, not the oppressive stillness that had haunted me before. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could truly breathe. It wasn't over, not entirely. The memories would remain, and the pain of losing my brother would never fully go away. But I knew now that I could live with it, that I could move forward, carrying his memory with me in a way that honored him, rather than chaining me to the past. I got up, feeling a sense of purpose, of determination. It was a new day, a new beginning. And as I stepped outside into the warmth of the sun, I knew that I was finally free. Free to live, free to heal, and free to find peace, both for myself and for my brother. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled.